Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in this world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for the event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started with that, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, just know you'll be receiving an email post-event that will take you right to the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question for our panelists at any time during the event, just use the GoToWebinar control panel, submit your questions, and we should take probably about 10 minutes or so at the end of the event and go through those audience questions. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and jump right on into our webinar, DevOps Security, Build Time Identification of Security Issues, a case study with Jenkins, Docker, and AWS. Our speakers today are Tim Erlin, who is VP of Product Management and Strategy at Tripwire, and David Meltzer, Chief Technology Officer at Tripwire. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate your being here.
Thanks, Charlene.
So Tim, I know you are going to kick us off, so I'm going to turn it right over to you and let you do your thing.
All right, I will do that. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks everyone for spending a little time with us. I appreciate it. I wanted to start with a little bit of context for why we're here. I think it's hardly a controversial statement to say that DevOps is changing the way that organizations build and deploy applications. Nobody on this type of webinar is going to argue with that. But there are two things that make this conversation important. First, there are a lot of organizations that have adopted DevOps tools and processes, but there are, in fact, many, many more that haven't. Dave, what would you say in terms of percentage distribution of organizations that have adopted DevOps as a process versus those that haven't?
Yeah, the overall adoption is still, a minority. So maybe 25, 30% are actually using it in a prevalent way. But certainly the majority of organizations out there are doing something DevOpsy in one application or in one team, even if it's not the way that every application for every team is being rolled out.
Yeah, and I think that touches on part of the point there is that where there is adoption, it's not necessarily comprehensive. And what I'm getting at there is that there's a lot of room for DevOps as a practice to both develop and to grow. There are a lot of organizations, a lot of groups within organizations that haven't really engaged with DevOps as a movement. So it's still an early stage technological movement. The second reason that we're here is that DevOps is really set to transform information security. And to be frank, I don't think anyone really knows what that means yet. We're at the forefront of that intersection of DevOps and security. And if you want to call it DevSecOps, that works. But this is something new, and it's something that's going to grow and change as we move forward. So we're here today to explore a little bit about information security and DevOps and some things that you can do about it in this webinar. And anytime that I'm talking about a topic in this area, I always like to start with industry problems. And it's tempting with DevOps to start with technology. It's a very technologically focused area. There are a lot of interesting things. There's always something new to talk about. But businesses fundamentally adopt DevOps as a solution to business problems, not simply because of the technology. So Dave, from your perspective, what problems have you seen customers solving with the DevOps toolkit or DevOps as a practice?
Well, as a whole, it's really about trying to get the collaboration working more effectively. So yeah, people often jump to technology when they think about DevOps, but really the fundamental is bringing together development teams and operations teams and now QA teams and security teams together. Now, in doing that, you can solve a lot of problems, and particularly one of the focuses is the area of speed. How quickly can we get code out to a production release, and how can we reduce that time cycle down? That's one of the key values DevOps approaches can give you.
Absolutely. So that doesn't mean that there aren't problems, as Dave said, and I want to start by talking about those industry problems that we see that are relevant to the webinar today. The first of which, they're all going to be security focused, just to give a little spoiler there. The first of which is containers being deployed with unacceptable risk. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. In this case, we're talking about the absence of a pre-deployment security assessment or scanning phase, and the end result of containers being pushed to production with risks that are unacceptable. And there are a few places. Well, so first of all, if you're playing DevOps webinar bingo, I think you probably get a point for this slide with this image. But although it's a bit trite and you've seen it a lot, it's important because it gives us a chance to talk about where risk can be introduced into this process. So one of the obvious places that risk can be introduced is in code you develop. So as you're building the applications with the code that you personally develop as an organization or as a developer, that's a place where risk can be introduced. Another place where risk can be introduced is in that build process. So this is where you're pulling in code that somebody else developed potentially. And that can also introduce risk into the process. Ideally, you want to catch and address that risk before deployment. But in most cases, this test phase that's labeled here is more about functional testing, about unit tests, about quality rather than security. And that means that those risks end up in production. And those risks could be a couple of different types. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about the kinds of risks that can be introduced into deployed containers in the pre-deployment phase?
Yeah, so if you look at this slide, you really have these issues that fall into a couple of different categories. You have source code related vulnerabilities, and those are things that source code analysis tools have traditionally focused on, things that relate to the unique custom code that your developers are building in your organization. You also have to deal with code from different libraries and third-party packages that you're incorporating from everything from the operating system to the software libraries to all the different middleware and server services that are running on those systems. Once you have those systems, even if they're the latest, most secure versions of them, how you configure those libraries, applications, and services can also create issues and vulnerabilities into your environment. And then you might also just have libraries that you don't want deployed within your organization. So you kind of put those all together and you have this difference between your own custom code that you're trying to deal with, third-party code, known vulnerabilities in those state, and then unknown vulnerabilities that may come and exist in the future.
And I want to make a couple of points here. One, this slide is specifically talking about risk rather than vulnerabilities, and that's important because while it's tempting to boil down this topic to identifying and addressing vulnerabilities, risk comes in multiple categories, as we've discussed. One of those categories that's easy to miss is compliance. It's not a technology risk in all cases, but fundamentally a non-compliant system that's deployed in an audit can result in material fines. And that has a real impact on the organization. So when you're talking about security in this context, it's important to be broad and talk about risk. And when you narrow the scope to maybe just vulnerabilities, that means that you might be missing risk and pushing it into production as well. So that's the first industry problem. The second is around images in repositories that become vulnerable. So while you may make no changes to a system or an image, changes occur outside of your environment that may increase risk or cause a change in risk profile. What does that mean? So if you imagine a Docker repository, might start out as secure, especially if you put secure and compliant images into it. But as time passes, one of the interesting things about security is that whether you make changes or not, changes occur in the known vulnerabilities that exist outside of your environment. Changes might also occur in terms of regulations and standards that apply to your environment. So even though you've changed nothing about those images in the repository, they can become vulnerable or they can start to exhibit risk because of changes external to the environment. And as that occurs, that previously secured and tested repository can become populated with risk. And if you're not testing those images in the repository, you then move into a state where risk is unknown because you simply haven't tested them. So that's the second problem. And then the third problem is that production assessment is too late in the process. Now, this may seem like it's related to the first problem, and they are related, but there's a different angle here that's worth talking about. Because when you recognize that first problem of um, unacceptable risk being deployed into production, a very reasonable step to take there is to try and address that problem by applying the existing security tools that you may have at your disposal. But many of those tools, if not all of them, are built for a different kind of environment. They're not built for DevOps. And as a consequence, you end up trying to apply tools that are designed for servers and laptops and network devices to an environment where they're not appropriate. How many of you have been asked about putting security agents inside of containers, for example, or about vulnerability scanning of production containers that are running, deployed containers? Now, to be fair, these aren't patently bad ideas, but they are insufficient, or perhaps better said, they are inefficient in terms of addressing the problems at hand. So those are the three industry problems that we want to talk about today. We've laid them out. And from there, I want to just move into what are the solution requirements that we're looking at in order to address these challenges. So an obvious first requirement is that any solution to this problem address the challenge of images prior to deployment. Meaning that as we said in the last problem, a set of tools that purely address deployed production containers is insufficient and inefficient. So pre-deployment assessment is absolutely a requirement. Integration is another requirement in terms of interoperating with the tools that are involved in the DevOps tool chain. Dave, do you want to say a little bit about why this particular requirement is important?
Yeah, and then as we walk through some of the case study, I think it'll become even more apparent. But when we talk about integrating security into DevOps, almost by definition, we need to figure out how are we going to automate this entire process. If the traditional security threat modeling approach might be, well, we're going to get the security team to look at our application, and 2 weeks later, they're going to give us an evaluation of whether it was secure. But if you're trying to get a build out in the next 30 minutes to your latest test server or promotion to production, you certainly can't wait 2 weeks. You need things that are going to operate on the scale of seconds or minutes. And you can only do that by pushing it directly into the pipeline.
Absolutely. The other piece there that I think fits is the switching between tools that we've talked about at times. That if you're involved in the process, you want to make sure that you have the results from an assessment within the tool that you're using, and maybe there's additional data elsewhere, but that integration is important for consistency with the velocity, as you mentioned. The next requirement is scope. And this is an interesting one because it goes back to that challenge of talking about risk versus talking about vulnerabilities. In order to address risk, you have to make sure that the solution you put in place actually has the scope of identifying risk as opposed to a more narrow set of conditions. And then there's also a requirement for accessibility. This is an interesting one as well, because it's put in terms of making sure that wherever you've put in place the DevOps process and DevOps lifecycle, and maybe you're in an organization where actually there are multiple teams using different processes across a large organization, the security tool set, the solution, needs to be accessible for all of those teams so that images can be pushed and assessed from hybrid environments, whether they're ultimately deploying into a cloud provider, or they're running in a cloud provider, or they're in a private environment or an on-premise environment. The service needs to support those myriad of environments. And it also needs to be able to scale dynamically. That's a requirement that fits into accessibility, because as you drive increased activity in your process, in your DevOps process, you need to be able to support security at that scale as well. And then finally, the last solution requirement to talk about is that the solution needs to be policy driven. What does that mean? Well, there's a temptation within security to declare that every vulnerability discovered is bad and has to be fixed. The reality is that different organizations have different levels of risk tolerance. And in a process like DevOps and deployment to production, a push to production, there are risk thresholds that different groups within the organization or different organizations may tolerate in terms of a push to production. So having a tool that doesn't simply report all of the findings, but actually a solution that provides a means to say this is the level of risk we'll tolerate for for different responses to discovered risks, allows for a much more functional solution in a dynamic environment. So with those solution requirements in mind, we can move on to the case study itself. As we said, this is a case study involving Jenkins, AWS, and Docker. So we're really looking at an example of applying a set of pre-deployment controls to that type of an environment. And in this case, we're actually going to introduce a new tool from Tripwire called Tripwire for DevOps. So for those of you who are here, this is a new product that Tripwire is releasing, formally announcing at the Black Hat conference in a couple of weeks. But we're going to do a preview of it here as well, and talk through how it fits into the environment, how it solves some of these problems. And I'm going to let Dave do most of the talking through the demo piece, and I'll pipe in where I think I've got things to add, or where he asks me to. So Dave, do you want to start here?
Yep, excellent, and thanks, Tim. And as I walk through this case study, I think actually this is going to be an interesting conversation, because this is a situation where we were building a new cloud service, and we're building it fundamentally as a SaaS service, cloud native development, and decided to heavily make use of Docker containerization technology. And in the course of that, because we are a security company, one of the first things we looked at was, how are we going to secure this application that we're going to build in a DevOps type model that we're going to deploy in a public cloud environment, and is going to be made up of a collection of Docker container images that are going to be continuously built up by our development team. We chose in the back end, we were going to use GitHub for source control, and we were going to use Jenkins for our build process. And then we're using some additional tools like Terraform to then instantiate infrastructure and do deployments of our different container services. One of the challenges we then faced was, okay, well, how do we make sure that each time a developer makes a new code change into one of these containers and we make new builds in an automated way, those trigger off of the source code commits, how do we make sure it's actually secure? We have a variety of products at Tripwire that can do assessments of running containers, non-running containers, virtual machines, cloud management interfaces, AWS platform services. But in this case, the issue was, we really want to insert this directly into the DevOps lifecycle and directly into the DevOps tool set. And so what we've actually built up is, as I'm showing you the SaaS service that offers this assessment of containers in a dynamic way, we actually am showing you a demo of us using our SaaS service for assessing containers to assess the security of our SaaS service that assesses containers. So kind of a meta analysis of our demo that we're showing here. And the first thing that you see here is, this is Jenkins. And one of the things that we realized early on in building the service was, primarily our application developers are working in the world of source code analysis, IDEs, they're writing code in Python, they're building new containers, but Jenkins is where they're doing builds. And for them, security assessment is just one of the quality gates that when that team makes a build, they want to get an assessment of before we decide, does that build pass or fail? And so there's a variety of other automated tests that are going on for things like scale and performance and regression testing. And the security assessment around infrastructure, known vulnerabilities just fits directly in here. And so here, as you're looking at Jenkins, you can see here that we were doing a scan that is associated with this particular pull request. If you then go to the next screen, Tim, in the results, we'll then get to we'll then get to, well, how did we actually get this information into our Jenkins system? We actually built up the service in AWS itself is just using some really simple REST APIs. So we have some integrations that can make pretty quick work of just pulling out of those APIs information about assessment that we have been done, or to push a new container image that has just been built in Jenkins into the service. So you have this really simple, just Docker push model. And in fact, our AWS service can operate as a Docker repository that you can push images to, not for the purpose of storing the images for your organization, but just for the purpose of, if you have an authenticated user in our service, you push a Docker container image into it, it will then get analyzed for security risk in an automated way. And if you're familiar and interested in scripting, you can actually go in and edit those results.
Yep. And this tool in particular, TW Docker, is the result of the team building their own scripts for integration and then ultimately productizing that in a way that makes it very easy to integrate and is downloadable. The tool itself is downloadable from the Tripwire for DevOps interface. And it returns the results. You can get them as a JSON format, but also as JUnit test results. And that's important because it allows for that easy integration back into Jenkins or other tools, so that the results you're getting are part of the process, right, Dave?
Yep, absolutely. So now here's what we're showing you is some test results in Jenkins. For the application developers, what they're then able to see after a build's made is, did we assess the specific containers that we found in those builds? So if you made new container images, did anything change in those? If they did, we can look for vulnerabilities in that system. Known vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, these are the sort of things that you would want to look for, and then present directly in Jenkins the results around what are the security issues or vulnerabilities. And in some later slides, I'll show you some of the detailed information about what specifically does the developer need to go fix for this build to pass. And so even though all of this complicated security analysis is happening up in the cloud in the sandbox environment, I'll talk more about how we do that on the back end. From the developer's perspective, it's just making a very simple call out to get that assessment done, and then presenting the results directly back in their build system.
So one of the types of results that we return that's important and a little bit different is the inventory of applications that were found in those containers. So the way that Tripwire for DevOps works, it assesses vulnerabilities, but in order to perform that vulnerability assessment, it actually filters, tests for, and then filters based on the applications that were discovered. So we're testing a dynamically filtered list of vulnerabilities. But that application inventory data is important because it can also introduce risk. So if you understand that a container image has a particular purpose, it's scoped for a particular use, it should have a very specific set of software on it, and you're introducing applications into the environment that are unacceptable or unexpected, that's something that you might want to flag in terms of that assessment, that security scan prior to deployment.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point, which is we talked a little bit about this idea of sandboxing, which is how we're performing the assessments. There are some different techniques you could use to find out what is the vulnerabilities that exist within a Docker image. And so there's different approaches you could use. One of them is to mount the file system essentially of the image and look at the contents of the files. The approach that Tripwire has taken is we actually build up a sandbox environment where we'll take the image, we'll instantiate it, meaning we'll actually stand it up in a live isolated environment. And by standing it up in an isolated environment, we can actually see what happens in the container when it's actually running versus a static analysis, which would only give you a picture of the base set of the file system and not actually what's running on the system. When we've dug into this from a research perspective at Tripwire, we found there's actually a broad set of vulnerabilities that could exist within containers that you can't detect from a purely static approach. So the idea of this dynamic sandboxing approach to container assessment is something, as you're thinking about how might I integrate to the DevOps pipeline, really contemplate the value of that type of approach.
So I want to talk a little bit about the alternative to that approach and what the result is. So for example, if you didn't do that type of scanning, you have the potential to push into production risks that you can't detect, prior to deployment, and maybe you've put in place tools in production that would scan for those kinds of things. So, the best outcome there is that you'd have a vulnerability scanner running in production that finds those items and causes a whole bunch of friction in the process by coming back and saying you're introducing risks that you can't detect prior to deployment. So catching them early, it goes to that problem of production assessment is too late in the cycle. Being able to catch as much of the risk as possible and determine whether or not it's acceptable prior to deployment ultimately improves velocity.
Yeah, one of our security researchers had looked at one of the Apache struts vulnerabilities that was caused a major breach in the last year, and found this was one of those categories of things that a static analysis would just miss. And so you've given yourself a little bit of a security comfort because we did an assessment and maybe we found a cheap or an open source way of doing it. But if you're not actually finding the critical risks, you haven't actually added a whole lot to your security. So just something to keep in mind. As we keep going here, go ahead. Did you want to say something, Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so one of the things that we mentioned earlier on was that in order to be, one of the solution requirements was a policy-driven approach and the ability to specify what's acceptable and what isn't, and not a blanket, every issue you find is unacceptable. So this is the example of how that gate can be configured using, in this case, Lua scripting. It's incredibly flexible. This is a very simple example, looking for vulnerabilities that have a particular CVSS score threshold, either with CVSS v2 or v3. But this can be extended to address broader sets of conditions, including things like what applications are found, misconfigurations, those types of things as well. So that it can be a very organization-specific set of criteria that establish that threshold for what's allowable in production and what isn't.
Yeah, and not to scare anyone who does not get enthusiastic about scripting, you certainly have some basic defaults you could certainly pick of, high risk vulnerabilities. We just want to use that as a default fail. But there's this powerful backend to let you get into organizational specific configuration in as deep a level as you would be interested in. And we actually found that's important to DevOps teams where they're used to often living in this scripting configurability type environment.
So from here, we're going to make a shift out of Jenkins into the Tripwire for DevOps tool and get a view of how the results are presented there. So we saw how the process can be integrated so that results show up in Jenkins in this case. But there's more data and more detail also available in Tripwire for DevOps.
Yep, and so here you can get a view of, we actually have a couple of different registries that we're monitoring. These are Docker compatible registries that we're monitoring for images. We've talked about this workflow of getting images pushed from your build system. And that's what I would call this the inline to the CI/CD pipeline approach. We've also had organizations who've asked us, well, maybe ultimately I do want to integrate to the pipeline, but it would actually be easier if I could just point at a registry and just monitor for new images getting pushed in there and do the integration at the registry point instead. And so you can point our service towards registries. We'll look at the images. We'll look for what images pass or fail. When new images appear into the registry, we'll reassess them, looking at those changes and tell you how that state differs. And the dashboard, which would be for someone from the security team or who wants to look over the overall security state, perhaps across multiple applications or multiple teams even, would get this dashboard view where you can see the state of the overall system. You could then dig in from there to the next piece, which would be then digging into the actual individual assessments. And so from that point, you could pick off an individual container image that was assessed and then go into the details of the specific vulnerabilities that were found within that system, applications we found, what the ultimate quality gate answer was for the system. So this, again, is more of that overall administrator view that is complementing the developer view, which the results are simply presented in line, and a developer wouldn't necessarily ever have to go to the SaaS piece of the service to actually see what's going on.
And I'll point out here there's just as a side note, there are 3 scores presented here actually. There are CVSS scores, both version 2 and version 3, which are fairly industry standard. There's also a Tripwire vulnerability score, which is a bit more granular. CVSS ranges from 0 to 10. And the Tripwire score ranges, in theory, from 0 to infinity. And the reason infinity is in there is because there's a time component to it. So that Tripwire score, if you're in a situation where you've got thousands of results, and you're trying to determine what to spend time on, how to prioritize, you might end up with hundreds or thousands of vulnerabilities that all score 10, and you're left with this question of which 10 is the most 10. The Tripwire score lets you discern at a more granular level, even though they're all terrible, which of them is really the most terrible and needs to be addressed most quickly. That score can, of course, be used as a threshold in that quality gate as well. So if that's something that the organization has adopted, great. If not, the CVSS scores are there as well as an industry standard approach.
So if you were then to dig into the details of any particular vulnerability, you would then get into not just exactly what is the vulnerability, some of the metadata are associated with it, but also the solution. What do you need to do to go fix it? So if an application developer just included a new library that created a new vulnerability in a container image, they can see, oh, this is what I did, this is the remediation, and hyperlinks to the actual vendor advisories or the source information, or a link to the latest package if that's what they're looking for. So all of that detail is available both for the admins and the application developers. And this is now the admin view to the application list, which was similar to what you saw from the application view on the Jenkins side earlier, of telling you what's actually running within this container image. And that's going to give you some additional flexibility for the discovery and searching for different things that are in existence, or giving you, again, that dynamic view into the state of your images.
And I think one of the interesting challenges, we talked at the beginning in terms of context, how DevOps is set to transform security. We've spent a lot of time talking to customers and to analysts about who's responsible for security in DevOps. And I think, Dave, maybe you might have a different conclusion than me, but what I've found is that there's a split there, that there isn't a single answer that sort of dominates that question. So in some cases, you have DevOps teams adopting security as part of what they're responsible for. And in some cases, you have security, a centralized security team, adopting DevOps as something they have to secure. And in order to solve this problem, both audiences become important. And that's part of why there are 2 approaches available here. One is this integrated approach, and the other is a separate tool that security can use as an overview for multiple DevOps teams or multiple repositories or multiple processes. Does that fit, Dave, with what you've seen as well?
Yeah, and it's it's two different lenses on the same problem. When I go and talk to the security teams or the parts of an organization running a vulnerability management program, very often the only systems they really have access and control over would be the production systems. And so they often know, well, if we could find these vulnerabilities and address them sooner, we know that would be a better security situation for ourselves to get into. We're just not sure how to shift our security earlier into the process. And now I think the adoption of DevOps tools has created this fresh opportunity for security teams to now shift left and get themselves into the development process. For an application developer who sees security either as a gate or sometimes an impediment to actually getting new code out to production quickly, using the automated tools that can perform these assessments inline will help give the security team comfort that we've already taken care of these issues. You'll actually help make the security team's job easier, and you'll actually help reduce the risk of the overall organization and check off that impediment of we have to get past that security gate before we can do application pushes. So I think it's a win for both sides to get this process working in a more automated, effective way.
And ultimately, security is really a function of quality. So when you're talking about deploying application services that meet a customer's need, an insecure service is ultimately a lower quality service. It puts the customer at risk or the business at risk, or potentially just doesn't function properly. So having that, having been in security for a long time, seeing that connection between dev, ops, and sec actually really feels like the right direction for security to go as a whole for me. So we'll move on back to this. Sorry, go ahead. No, feel free.
Yeah, I was going to move on to this slide then, where ultimately now we're getting the end of the result here, which is we've performed the assessment, we're getting the test results back into our Jenkins piece. Tests that pass then can move through the quality gates, and then that can automate the pushes out into your production systems. At that point, you may cut over to a production vulnerability management security configuration auditing tool that your security team is using. And there may be an opportunity at some point to look at, well, then how can we start to match up and link together the pieces of the SaaS inline pipeline assessment with the production assessment you're going to do after the fact, and start tracking and looking at changes between those things. So I think, really integrating into that DevOps tool set, working on the Jenkins side directly integrated into that build process are all things that really can help automate and integrate security into the whole DevOps process. And what our team has seen as a result of this is we now just know that we're not going to release this product with any known vulnerabilities or misconfigurations in containers, no matter what our developers do, no matter what new libraries they add. And that's given our security team more comfort as we launch this service and push it out into production. And it's given us more confidence to move quickly in a cloud-native SaaS development model as well.
So with that, we'll leave the case study and come back to those three industry problems that we talked about at the beginning. I always find that it's useful to start with a set of problems, go through the solution or the content, and then come back to them and talk about whether or not we've solved them. So if we start with that containers deployed with unacceptable risk problem, we can pick that apart a little bit. We talked certainly about the risk and the assessment of risk as a quality gate in the process. But also that term unacceptable and the understanding that there may be different levels of risk tolerance, and using a policy-driven approach to allow for acceptable risk to not become an impediment to velocity, but to catch unacceptable risk prior to deployment as well. That second problem, images in repositories becoming vulnerable. So we talked about scanning repositories, both as new images are added and also for the images that are present there, and capturing risk that may become problematic as an image stays in a repository and gets used later on. And then finally, that production assessment being too late challenge. We talked a bit about the tools for information security being built for production environments, and needing tools that are built for a DevOps process, for the DevOps toolchain that integrate into that process, that are addressed at the developers as much as security, and also the two different audiences that are currently both interested in securing the DevOps process today, and avoiding pulling engineers out of their workflow into another tool by having that integration. So I think as we've talked through those three problems, not surprisingly, I suppose we have solved them or talked about solutions to them, specifically with the Tripwire for DevOps tool and with our case study for our own development and deployment. Dave, is there anything that I missed there? Anything that you wanted to add?
I think you covered that well. I would say that there is more pieces that you would want to consider around your applications, like what about the cloud instances that you're deploying themselves? You certainly do want to think about the runtime pieces of your container protection as well. But from the pure assessment process, so really getting into that build piece, vulnerability assessment and looking at containers, I do think is one of the most important and one of the most fundamental things you can do to assure the security and reduce risks of what things are being pushed through the DevOps pipeline.
Great.
So, yep, go ahead.
With that, I think we're ready for some Q&A. We've got time for Q&A. I'm going to hand it to Charlene, who will moderate the Q&A for us.
Yes, and we've gotten some great questions in so far. Let's see. Okay, first one. Let's see. Does the Tripwire, the DevOps, support other CI tools than Jenkins?
Yes, so we also have some pre-existing integration with Team City that's working, but because the backend is simply a list of REST APIs and integration scripts, anything that would be compatible with JUnit, with the being able to push to a REST API and get a result, will be an easy integration. And we'll be announcing more open source and freely available integrations to additional tools after the initial launch coming in a couple of weeks here. Okay.
Great. Next question, can this scan for custom OS hardening compliance?
Yes. I guess the caveat I will give you is, there's a lot of devil in the details of configuration policies relative to specific operating systems. So assuming there's some general configuration, or you're talking about it's a Linux hardened OS and has some standardization around that, yes. If you're talking about some embedded operating system on a non-standard real-time OS, that would have to be a deeper conversation.
Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, next question. Is it possible to scan an AMI image?
Oh, that's a good question. So yes, it would be part of the standard existing Tripwire tools, actually. Actually, Dave, you might want to answer it in the context of Tripwire for DevOps. But generally speaking, we could use existing Tripwire tools to scan running AMIs.
Yep, and so as we kind of think through the workflow, running AMIs we're supporting today, we are looking at, because we've built up sandboxing services around Docker containerization first, you will be seeing some additional capability to sandbox and assess other types of virtual environments, and we'll have some announcements about that coming out later this year.
Okay, all right, great. Just a reminder to the audience, if you have a question for either Tim or Dave or both of them, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel, submit your questions. Next question, can I implement any of this use case without Tripwire for DevOps?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is I think you might end up building Tripwire for DevOps in the process. So as Dave pointed out, this in some ways started for us as a need to secure our own DevOps pipeline, our own CI/CD pipeline, and because we have a team of developers who are used to building product, it made sense for us to push a product, into development to solve these problems. But there are, the tools that are out there are pretty flexible in terms of integration. So you could do things like, integrate with Jenkins. You'd have to write the scripting to do it and run a vulnerability scan. Building a sandbox would be a difficult challenge there. So I think you could get part of the way there. And I think there are a lot of really creative folks out there who like to work on those kinds of things. But when you're looking at a tool that can accomplish it, we found that there was a lot of work that we could do to make it a commercial available tool to shorten the process.
Okay, great. Next question, do you have any recommendations on supporting FedRAMP requirements, and does your tool support it?
That's a good question as well. So FedRAMP is an open consideration for us, a roadmap item, if you will. We're definitely interested in heading in that path as we move forward. It won't be FedRAMP validated at the initial release.
Okay, excellent. Next question, can you please summarize what are the different kinds of scans that are performed beyond open source?
Sure. So when you think about assessment of a container or of a virtual environment, first we talk about known vulnerabilities. So traditional vulnerability assessment, which can operate, which has we have a security research team and has thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities that it can look for with specific coverage of the kind of things that you would find often in these in a Docker container or these kind of environments. So the first piece is the known vulnerability piece. The second piece would be configuration against hardening standards. So that's the second thing that you may look for. Now, some additional areas that is not part of what Tripwire does, but you may also just want to consider for DevOps CI/CD integrations would be source code analysis tools. So things that are focused on the code that's being written, looking for custom vulnerabilities in that application code. And there's a market around that source code analysis piece. And then the other piece might be an intellectual property assessment, looking for did someone include an unlicensed library or plagiarize some code on the internet. And there's other vendors who are looking at that kind of area as well. So that's kind of the universe of assessment pieces. We provide that infrastructure or known vulnerability and configuration auditing pieces within our service.
All right, great. All right, let's see, next question. Is there a list of all the assessments performed by your tool?
And with the launch material, I think that kind of gets to the previous question as well.
Okay.
We'll have a list of supported platforms, and because it's leveraging our existing IP360 and Tripwire Enterprise products, you can go look at the existing material around those for the list of coverages, platforms, and policies we could cover with that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I can add some numbers to that. So there are more than 100,000 vulnerabilities that we can test for, thousands of applications that we can identify, and something like 800 platform and policy combinations.
Wow.
Not 100 of those, not 100% of those would necessarily apply, because some of them might be fairly esoteric and things that you won't find in containers, but that gives you just an idea of the breadth.
Okay, great. Next question, can I generate PCI DSS compliance reports with this tool?
I'm thinking about how to answer that question. So in terms of if you have a PCI, if you're trying to assess compliance of containers against the PCI standard, that would be a compliance standard that we support. It's not an approved scanning vendor tool. So there is a additional PCI requirement for doing external scans performed by an approved scanning vendor. But that wouldn't apply to pre-production assessment. That would have to be a production deployed assessment in order to meet the ASV requirement. So I'm not sure that would fit. So I think the answer is yes, with all of that context added in.
Okay, great. I've had a couple people ask about the TW Docker utility. One is asking, let's see, where can we get the utility? And another person is asking, where is it physically deployed?
Yep. So in terms of where to get, go ahead, Tim.
Well, the utility is part of the Tripwire for DevOps tool, so it's downloadable from the Tripwire for DevOps interface to be used with Tripwire for DevOps.
Okay. All right. And then as far as it being physically deployed?
So those scripts would sit on or alongside your build server. So if you were going to integrate to Jenkins, you would take those code snippets and stick it into that system.
All right. Great. Okay. Let's see. Next question. What about containers deployed in private clouds or on-premise systems? Easy for me to say.
Yep. So the way that our service is working is we're doing the assessment in our backend sandboxing service. So we have an isolated environment where the images get instantiated, get assessed, and then get destroyed. And then we just present the results back to you. Where you actually then store your images in a repository or instantiate them to run in production is completely up to you. And that can be in your own private cloud. It can be in any public cloud provider. It can be on a physical host running a Docker host. So that's all completely independent of our service. We're running it in a cloud environment so that there's nothing for you to have to go deploy, manage, or operate to get the sandboxing assessment to run.
Okay, great. Next question. Will you offer this, or do you offer this as a managed service?
There isn't a managed service offering today. There won't be at launch. It's certainly under consideration. We do have other managed services. In this case, it's a SaaS service. I'd be interested if anybody wants to provide feedback, of course, in what what they would like to get out of a managed service in this case. For me, it's always important that the managed service actually add value on top of the product rather than just being a repackaging of the product. So definitely interested in feedback there.
Okay, great, great. Well, just a reminder to the audience that the Tripwire folks are getting a copy of all the questions that are answered, so I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you on something like the managed service offering and other questions that you might have that we don't get to during this webinar. Okay, the next question, does Tripwire do any assessments for production deployed containers?
Sure, so Tripwire, obviously this is not our only or first product. Tripwire has a vulnerability management system, configuration compliance, both of which work for production deployed containers and other images as well.
Okay, great. Let's see, next question. What is the licensing model? Per image, per scan, or per image scan, or what are you guys looking at for that?
The licensing model is per image scanned, and it's sold in blocks basically.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's pretty much all the questions that we had. Let's see, I'll go do my spiel and see if we get any other last minute questions in. Want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any or all of it, you'll be able to access it on demand on the Security Boulevard website. We'll also have, we also have on that site a listing of all of our other webinars, both upcoming and on demand, so you should be able to see everything we've got, and hopefully there'll be one or two others that pique your interest while you're there on the site. And I haven't seen any other questions come in, so I would like to thank everybody who did submit questions. And I also want to thank Tim Erlin and Dave Meltzer for giving such a great presentation. Judging from the number of questions, I think folks got a lot out of it. I know I did too, so thanks to you both. I really appreciate it. Thank you also to the audience for attending today's event. And I am Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.